Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and for perfectly pronouncing my name. I appreciate that. Thank you to you. Thank you to members of the committee. Having spent my adult life as a scholar of Afghanistan, it is a privilege to be with you. I first traveled there in 2004 and made 11 extended trips thereafter, the last of which took place in the summer of 2021. I start by stating a fact on which I presume we can all agree. America's longest war was not lost in 20 days or 20 months, but rather over 20 years. 4 presidents made decisions that brought us here, and each one's policies constrained those who followed. Ultimately, and in many ways, the logic, design, and implementation of the war doomed the Afghan Republic. This contention does not suggest American malice, nor does it absolve Afghan guilt. But we must be clear. The United States and its allies went to war in the fall of 2001 because al-Qaeda attacked our homeland. The subsequent promotion of women's rights, democracy, and development mattered to the degree they advanced the war on terror. A friendly government in Kabul, not a sovereign Afghan state, was the goal. This truth helps us understand the back to the future moment in which we and the Afghan people find ourselves with the Taliban once again at the helm. A number of early choices taken by the United States and its allies crippled the new Afghan government before it even got started. The Taliban regime fell swiftly, and its successor owed its existence to the West. In exchange, it would not control many of the fundamental decisions about power and politics on the ground. The Americans prevented President Karzai from exploring any genuine possibility of peace with those Talibs who sought surrender, a choice that would haunt US governments years later when it aimed to negotiate with those same enemies on vastly worse terms. The United States emboldened Pakistan as a key partner in the war, even as the Pakistani security establishment gave sanctuary to those who killed American and Afghan forces for years to come. The coalition empowered anti-Taliban commanders as its core ground force early on and later as counterinsurgent militia forces. Even as some of those strongmen became valuable governing partners, others leveraged ongoing American support to their own ends, often at the expense of new civil and military institutions. The United States invested substantial aid in those institutions, but in erratic, incoherent, and unsustainable terms. The risks of such built-in dependencies were especially evident in the Afghan security sector. The triumph of foreign designs over Afghan self-determination was also exemplified in the international approach to elections. Foreign powers set an overly ambitious tempo and then selectively addressed fraud in terms that steadily undermined public trust and risked turning each electoral standoff into a civil war. By the time the 2019 election arrived in Afghanistan, the Trump administration made clear that the time for our involvement there was over. A quick deal with the Taliban was a priority, even if that meant sacrificing the country's future as a democracy. The ultimate precarity of Afghan sovereignty would be most vividly revealed in 2020 when the Trump administration signed the Doha Agreement with the Taliban. A boon to the Taliban, this deal undercut any remaining leverage the Afghan government might have had in subsequent negotiations to sue for peace without entirely sacrificing Republican values. The Trump administration then unilaterally dropped troop levels to 4,500 and just days before President Biden's inauguration to 2,500. Meanwhile, the Afghan government was forced to release thousands of Taliban prisoners, a provision in a deal to which it had not been a party. I was in Kabul in March 2020, and the sense of collective despair was palpable. Deeply disillusioned with their own leaders, Afghans were also resentful that their experiment with free politics mattered little to the Americans as we beat a path to the exits. My last visit to Kabul in the summer of 2021 is one I will never forget. Afghan leaders were both disbelieving about and therefore unprepared for the impending American departure, and yet also so crippled by its possibility that dysfunction had arrested the entire state. More striking, however, was the courage of my many longtime interlocutors in civil society who understood that all they built was now in jeopardy. They vowed not to give up, though nearly all were eventually forced to leave in the face of near certain persecution or death. The progress they secured gives me great optimism for Afghanistan's long-term future. But their sacrifices, as well as those of our own, demand our honest and deep reflection. We may not again engage in state building in the service of countering terrorism, but all of our interventions disrupt the politics and lives of others profoundly. We must learn from the Afghan war both the productive possibilities and acute limits of American power, and try then to wield it with greater humility and care. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor. Thank you all for your comments. I'm sorry, I cannot agree with what you said. I will just start by saying I do define a win as the outcomes being better than what I expected, and a loss being the outcomes being worse than what I expected. So I can't agree with you, but we'll have time to discuss this and debate this, as everybody will.